You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my property before I call security. Richard Blackstone's voice cut the December cold air like a sharp blade. Her gray eyes settled in Maria Santos, who was standing at the entrance of the executive office with one hand protecting the belly of 7 months of gestation. The rain was hitting the 40th floor panoramic windows of Blackstone Industries, creating a dark scenery for what was unfolding. Maria had worked as the company's human resources manager for 8 years, building a flawless reputation and gaining the confidence of hundreds of Philippine employees that she had helped to join the corporation. "Mr. Blackstone, I just need a few days to recover from the medical appointment," Maria said in a firm but visibly shaken voice. "The doctor said the baby needs special monitoring and—" "Don't come to me with excuses about your personal situation," interrupted Richard, adjusting the fists of the $3,000. "You have been hired to work, not to use the company as your private social security. People like you always find an excuse not to fulfill your obligations." Mary's expression hardened. At 34, she had faced discrimination before, but never so explicit and cruel. What Richard didn't know was that Maria Santos wasn't just another employee trying to keep her job. She had a law training from the University of Philippines and had reached the United States with a very specific purpose in mind. "People like me," he repeated Maria, and something in her tone made Richard hesitate for a second fraction. "Interesting choice of words, Mr. Blackstone, especially considering that people like me represent 40% of this company's workforce." Richard walked to his massive mahogany table, where dismissal papers were already prepared. His assistant had been instructed to have everything ready for this conversation. "Your termination is effective immediately. Human Resources will process your latest payments, and you have until the end of the day to remove your personal belongings." But Maria remained motionless, observing her movement with attention that was not common in desperate employees to maintain her jobs. There was something in her dark eyes that suggested that she knew exactly where this conversation was walking. During the last months, small signs have begun to make sense to her. Meetings where your presence was no longer requested. The comments whispered when she passed the corridors. The gradual reduction of his responsibilities, apparently to protect his pregnancy, but was actually careful preparation for this moment. "Before you sign anything," she said calmly, taking the phone out of her pocket, "I would like you to hear a little recording I made last week." His voice had a disturbing serenity to someone who had just lost his job. Richard frowned, clearly annoyed. "I don't have time for your dramatic games. Subscribe to the papers." And the sound that left Maria's phone made Richard's blood freeze in his veins. It was his own voice, clear as crystal, coming out of the speakers. "These Philippines are reproducing like rabbits in my company. We need to find legal ways to get rid of them before they demand too much rights." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard realized that he had been recorded during a conversation he thought was deprived with his chief financial officer. Maria kept looking at him with that disconcerting calm, as if he had just revealed only the tip of a much larger iceberg. "How do you dare to record me without permission?" Richard exploded, but his indignation sounded more as desperation than authority. "This is illegal. I will sue it by invasion of privacy." "In fact," Maria responded with a smile that didn't come to the eye, "in the state of Washington, only one party needs to consent to the recording, and I consent." She paused, letting the information sink. "Besides, I'm sure the legal department will be fascinated to know that you have such colorful opinions about racial discrimination in the workplace." Richard felt a drop of sweat drip by his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept the cold office. The realization that he had been completely overcome by an employee he considered disposable was beginning to settle in his mind. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, keeping the phone back in her pocket, "I believe our conversation is just starting, and I have the impression that you will want to sit for what comes next." For a moment, while the rain continued to hit the windows and Seattle's horizon disappeared in the mist, Richard Blackstone realized that he had completely underestimated the woman who was before him. There was something in Maria Santos that went far beyond a pregnant employee trying to keep his job. There, in the face of all the eyes of contempt he had faced over the years, she remained firm as those who keep too powerful secret to be revealed before the right time. The storm that was about to trigger would make Richard question everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and the consequences of underestimating the wrong people. If this story of prejudice and unexpected twists has aroused its curiosity, subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple resignation would become the biggest nightmare of a businessman who believed he was above the consequences of his own prejudices. "Delete this recording immediately," Richard roared, but his voice trembled in a way that was not unnoticed. I don't know what kind of blackmail you think you're doing, but it won't work with me. Maria remained impassive, observing him with those eyes that seemed to keep much deeper secrets than a simple, compromising recording. Breeding is a strong word, Mr. Blackstone. I prefer to call documentation of a behavioral pattern. Behavioral pattern? Richard laughed, but sweat on his forehead betrayed his growing nervousness. A casual conversation between executives is no evidence of anything. Maybe not, Maria agreed, walking slowly to the panoramic window. But I wonder what the work department would think about the emails you sent to HR suggesting that Philippines were relocated to less visible positions during visits by international investors. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain against the glass. Richard felt like the floor was disappearing under his feet. Those emails existed, but they were confidential internal communications. How could a simple HR manager access executive correspondence? You're inventing, he said, but his conviction had completely evaporated. Maria smiled for the first time since she entered the office, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of those who finally removed the mask after years pretending to submission. You know, for 8 years working here, I learned a lot about how this company really works. I learned about secret codes and performance ratings that marked employees for their ethnic origin. I learned about the promotions systematically denied people with surnames who didn't sound Americans. And especially, I learned to document everything. Richard retreated instinctively. The woman before him was no longer the submissive employee that he thought could easily dispense. There was something in her posture, in the way he said, which suggested a much more extensive preparation than he could imagine. During the last 3 years, Maria continued, her voice assuming almost educational tone, I collected more than 200 evidence of systematic discrimination in this company. Emails, memos, gathering recordings, statistical analysis of negotiated promotion, staff testimonials, a true corporate prejudice encyclopedia. This is impossible, Richard muttered, but his mind was already running through all reckless conversations, all questionable decisions every moment when his prejudices had to guide his professional actions. Maria opened her bag and removed a thick paste. I know it's hard to believe, so I brought some samples. She opened the folder and started reading. Richard Blackstone's March 15th email to Jennifer Walsh, REH. We need to be more selective in hiring processes. Candidates with very loaded accents can affect our corporate image. Richard's face lost all the color. He remembered perfectly from that email. Or this one, Mary continued, becoming a page. Memorandum confidential of August 2nd. I recommend transferring Maria Santos to an administrative position that limits your contact with international clients. Your appearance and accent can generate misenforcing impressions of our professional standards. Stop, Richard whispered. But Maria was not over. And my personal favorite, she said, her voice loaded with bitter irony. Transcript of the November 10th executive meeting, where you said, and I quote, these Philippine immigrants work hard, I admit, but they do not have the sophistication necessary for leadership positions. It is better to keep them in operational functions, where they can be useful without compromising our image. Richard fell into his chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his conscience. It wasn't just a disgruntled employee. It was a meticulous investigation, led by someone who had played a much longer and more intelligent game than, and never suspected. What haunted him was not just to have been recorded, but the ease with which Maria quoted specific conversations, exact dates, decisions that he thought were made in absolute confidentiality. How many other conversations had been documented? How many other executives were involved in this network of discrimination that he had helped build? What do you want? He asked, his voice reduced to a defeated whisper. Maria closed the paste and kept her carefully in her bag. I want justice, Mr. Blackstone. Not only to me, but for every Filipino employee who had his career sabotaged for his systematic prejudices. I want the truth about this company to come out. You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. Richard tried to recover some control over the situation. This would destroy the company. Hundreds of jobs would be lost. Funny, Maria replied, walking toward the door. During all these years, I've never been concerned about jobs when she fired Philippine staff for manufactured reasons. But now, when her own position is threatened, she suddenly discovered social concern. His steps were measured, calculated. Each movement suggested someone who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in his mind. Do you know what impresses me most, Mr. Blackstone? Throughout these years, the Lord really believed we were invisible, that we did not pay attention to your conversations, that we did not understand the implications of your decisions. She stopped at the door and turned one last time. Oh, and Mr. Blackstone, that medical consultation I mentioned was actually a meeting with my lawyer, Dr. Patricia Chen, a specialist in labor rights and racial discrimination. Perhaps you know her. She is also Philippine and has also been underestimated by executives like you for years. You planned all this, Richard murmured, more to himself than for her. I didn't plan, Mary corrected her hand on the door handle. I only document. The Lord planned his own fall with every prejudiced comment, with each discriminatory decision, with every moment he chose prejudice instead of justice. The door closed gently behind her, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his own words and actions. For the first time in his career, he realized that he had found an opponent who not only knew the rules of the game, but had spent years silently rewriting them. The phone on his table started ringing, but he couldn't move to answer. Her mind was processing a terrible truth. How many other people like Mary existed in her company? How many other time pumps had he created without realizing it? 3 hours have passed since Maria had left the office, and Richard could not focus on anything. Each attempt to return to work was interrupted by the memory of those serene eyes that seemed to know exactly what they were doing. He had tried to call his private lawyer, but the secretary said he was in an important audience and would only return on Monday. Mr. Blackstone? The voice of Jennifer Walsh, HR's director, startled him. She was standing in the door with a worried expression that Richard had never seen before. I need to talk to the Lord urgently. If it's about Maria Santos, I already solved the situation, Richard said, trying to sound confident, but Jennifer shook her head slowly. In fact, sir, we have received a call from the work department for an hour. They want to schedule a complete inspection of our human resources archives for next week. Her voice trembled slightly. And they specifically requested all records related to staff of Philippine origin of the past 5 years. Richard's blood froze. How they knew about, he interrupted, realizing that he had said too much. Jennifer frowned. What did you know about, sir? Is there anything I know? There was a new distrust in his voice, as if pieces of a puzzle were fitting into his mind. Nothing, Richard answered quickly, but his mind was running. Maria had left the building at 2 in the afternoon. It was now 5:30 and the labor department was already scheduling inspections. Efficiency was scary. Mr. Blackstone, Jennifer remained hesitant. Maria Santos worked with me for 8 years. She has always been one of the most competent employees we had. Her resignation today has been unexpected. The other Philippines are asking if there is anything they should know. Richard realized that Jennifer was not just informing about the government's connection. She was probing, trying to understand if there was a larger standard at stake. The loyalty he always assumed as guaranteed was starting to crack. Dr. Patricia Chen personally called Ma a meeting with us for tomorrow morning, Jennifer added, consulting her notes. She represents some employees on labor issues, said he has extensive documentation to discuss. That name made Richard's stomach to turn around. Patricia Chen, the lawyer that Maria had mentioned, the Philippine that had also been underestimated by executives like him for years. Now everything made sense. Maria had not simply collected evidence alone. She had built a network, an entire team dedicated to documenting and exposing her pattern of discrimination. I canceled all her meetings for tomorrow, Jennifer said, and there was something in her tone that suggested that she was already starting to distance herself from any association with Richard's questionable decisions. The meeting is scheduled for 9 in the morning in the main conference room. After Jennifer left, Richard walked to the window and looked at the city that stretched below him. Somewhere down there, Maria Santos was probably preparing for the final battle, and for the first time in his career, Richard Blackstone realized that he had found an opponent who not only knew the rules of the game, but had spent years silently rewritten them. The phone on your table rang again. It was his wife, Margaret. Richard, dear, did you see the news? There's a report on racial discrimination in technology companies. They are mentioning several Seattle companies. Their voice sounded worried. Do you think our company can be affected? Richard hung up the phone without answering. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the dark clouds remained, promising a much larger storm than anything Seattle had ever seen. A storm that he himself had helped create, underestimating the wrong woman at the wrong time. What this powerful man did not know was that Maria Santos had not arrived in the United States in search of opportunities. She had come in search of justice, and had just found the perfect target to demonstrate that underestimating the right people could be the most expensive mistake someone can make. The storm that was about to slaughter himself on him would rethink everything he believed about power, privilege, and the consequences of years of systematic arrogance. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office 2 hours earlier, hoping to have time to prepare some defense strategy before the meeting with Patricia Chen. But upon entering the executive elevator, he found something that made his blood freeze. Maria Santos was there, calmly typing on her phone as if nothing had happened the day before. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone," she said with that disturbing serenity he was beginning to fear. "I hope you had a good night's sleep. What are you doing here?" Richard managed to articulate, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. You were fired yesterday. Maria smiled, keeping the phone in her pocket. In fact, I haven't signed the dismissal papers yet, and as I found that I have some labor rights that have been neglected during these years, I thought it best to attend today's meeting to clarify everything at once. The elevator seemed to be rising in slow motion. Richard realized that he was stuck in a small space with a woman who clearly knew much more about her legal rights than he had assumed. What rights? Maternity leave pays in full, for example, Maria responded casually, something that this company has been systematically denied the Philippine employees for years. Interesting standard, don't you think? The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, but neither moved immediately. I also found that I am entitled to see my complete performance appraisal dossier. Do you know those confidential notes that are made about employees without their knowledge? Richard felt as if he was slowly strangled by an invisible rope. How could she have access to such specific information about internal policies? Dr. Patricia Chen has been very enlightening about my rights, Maria continued, leaving the elevator, and about the rights of 47 other Philippine employees who work here. It's amazing how many labor violations can go unnoticed when no one knows exactly what to look for. 47 employees. Richard had never stopped to tell how many Philippines worked in his company, but Maria had obviously done much more than telling. She had built a complete network. When they arrived at the main conference room, Richard found that it was not just Patricia Chen who was waiting for him. There were 3 lawyers sitting at the table, each with piles organized of documents. At the head of the table, an Asian woman of approximately 45 years stood up to greet to them. Mr. Blackstone, I'm Patricia Chen, she said with a firm hand grip and eyes that seemed to cross him as X-rays. Thank you for accepting our meeting on time. Our pleasure, Richard lied, trying to maintain some appearance of control of the situation. Maria, you can sit there. Patricia indicated a chair beside her. I brought some colleagues who have specific experience in cases similar to ours. Richard noted how she said ours, as if Mary and she were a team for a long time, what they probably were. Before we started, Patricia continued, opening a thick paste, I would like to clarify that this meeting is being recorded for legal purposes, as our right in Washington is right. I hope there are no objections. Richard wanted to protest, but realized that any resistance would only make him more guilty. No problem. Excellent. Patricia smiled, but it was the same kind of smile Maria had used. Polite, but with an underlying coldness that promised consequences. Mr. Blackstone, during the last 18 months, our firm has conducted extensive investigation into labor practices at Blackstone Industries. 18 months? Richard repeated, feeling as if he had just discovered that he was being observed much longer than he had imagined. Yes, we started when we received the first denunciation of systemic discrimination, one of the other lawyers explained. Since then, we have documenting a consistent standard of civil rights violations that specifically affects employees of Philippine origin. Patricia slid a folder through the table. This is just a sample of the evidence we collected. I would like you to take a look while we explain the scope of our investigation. Richard opened the folder with trembling hands. The first page was a detailed spreadsheet showing wage disparities between Philippine and American employees in identical positions. The differences were glaring. In some cases, they reached 30% for the same position and experience. As you can see, Maria spoke for the first time since she had sat. It's not just inappropriate comments or isolated questionable decisions. It's a complete discrimination system that affects promotions, wages, medical licenses, and even the distribution of important projects. Richard turned the page and found copies of emails he had sent over years. Emails that thought they were confidential. Internal communications that revealed a systematic discriminatory mindset. How had they been able to access all this? The question is not if there was discrimination, Patricia said softly. The question is what will be the extent of the necessary repairs. Repairs? Richard finally found his voice. Retroactive compensation of wages, moral damages, structural changes in the company, one of the lawyers listed. We are talking about a collective action that can easily reach 8 digits. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the air conditioner. Richard realized that he was not just facing the questionable dismissal of an employee. He was facing the possibility of complete destruction of everything he had built. Of course, Patricia continued, we are open to negotiations, but our first option is to bring this case to public judgment. The media has shown a lot of interest in stories about racial discrimination in technology companies. Richard looked at Maria, who remained sitting with that unshakable calm. She had orchestrated all this. For 18 months he had cooperated with an investigation that he didn't even know existed, and now she was sitting there, watching her life crumble with the same serenity with which a person watches the sunset. What terrified him was not only the extent of evidence against him, but the perception that he had completely underestimated the intelligence and determination of the woman who now holds her future in her hands. Maria Santos was not a victim. She was a strategist who had spent the perfect case against him. While lawyers continued to have evidence and discussing legal terms, Richard understood a terrible truth. The storm that was about to destroy everything he valued had been carefully cultivated by the person he had tried to discard as irrelevant. Before we went on with the negotiations, Patricia said, opening an even thicker second folder, I would like you to know that this meeting is being broadcast live to a very specific audience. Richard frowned, confused. Transmitted? To whom? Maria smiled for the first time since she sat, and it was a smile that promised devastating revelations. For the Blackstone Industries shareholder board, which is gathered at this very moment in the main hall, they requested a live broadcast of this meeting after they received some very interesting documents last night. Richard's blood completely froze. This is impossible. You don't have access to the advice. In fact, one of the lawyers has interrupted. Mrs. Santos has a very close relationship with some board members, especially after they found that 60% of the company's profits in the last 5 years have come from projects developed specifically by Philippine employees who have been systematically undervalued and poorly paid. Patricia turned on a laptop and turned the screen so that Richard could see. On the screen appeared the board meetings room, where 15 executives watched carefully to the broadcast. In the center of the table was Harold Blackstone Sr., Richard's father and founder of the company, with an expression of cold fury that Richard knew very well. Father, Richard whispered, but his voice did not reach the microphones. Mr. Blackstone, Patricia relentlessly continued, during the last 18 months we document not only wage and promotions discrimination, but also systematic intellectual appropriation. Projects developed by Philippine engineers were credited to American supervisors, generating millions in bonuses that never reached true creators. On the screen, Harold Mister raised a hand, signaling that he wanted to speak. Your voice came out clear by the speakers. Richard, you better have a very good explanation for what I'm listening to. Richard tried to answer, but the words simply didn't come out. Maria opened her bag and removed a tablet. It may be easier to show than explain, she said, connecting the device to the audio system. What followed was the reproduction of a recording that made the little blood left on Richard's face completely disappeared. It was a telephone conversation between him and the chief financial officer, where they openly discussed how to redistribute project credits for more presentable employees before investor presentations. These Philippines are good for doing dirty work. Their own voice echoed through the room and through the transmission, the council hall. But when it comes to introducing international customers, we need faces that inspire more confidence. My God, a feminine voice came out of the speakers. It was Margaret Hastings, the independent majority shareholder. This is evidence of systematic corporate fraud. The silence that followed was broken by Harold Sr. Richard, you are officially removed from all executive functions immediately. A complete investigation will be conducted, and depending on the results, we will consider legal action. Dad, wait! Richard shouted, rising sharply. This is a trap. They planned it all. Of course we planned, Maria responded calmly, devastating. For 18 months we systematically document how you have transformed this company into a hostile environment for people like me, and now the results speak for themselves. Patricia closed the laptop with satisfaction. Now, about repairs. We estimate that the compensation due to affected employees, including retroactive salaries, moral damages, and profit sharing, adds approximately $47 million. $47 million? Richard staggered, holding on the table. It was more than the personal net value that had accumulated in 2 decades of career. And that's just the beginning, another lawyer added. There are also federal fines for civil rights violations, criminal proceedings for intellectual appropriation, and of course, damage to reputation that will affect all future contracts of the company. Richard's phone started ringing incessantly. They were journalists, other executives, his wife. The story was already spreading around the city as fire in dry forest. Patricia got up, organizing her documents. You have 48 hours to decide whether to accept our proposal for agreement or if you prefer the process to go through the courts, where everything will become public. And when I say everything, I refer to the 200 evidence pages that have not yet been presented today. Is there more? Richard asked, his voice reduced to a whisper. Much more, Maria confirmed, keeping her things. Emails where you instruct HR to reject candidates with 2 ethnic names. Recordings where you plan to transfer Philippines to the night shift to improve the appearance of the main office. Forensic analyses, showing how bonuses were systematically denied to minorities. Richard dropped back in the chair, completely defeated. Why didn't you say anything before? Why did you let this reach this point? Mary stopped at the door, her eyes finding his last time. Because men like the Lord only listen when they no longer have a choice. I spent 8 years tries not being the perfect employee, believing that competence and dedication would be sufficient. But the Lord taught me that the only language that privileged people really understand is that of the consequence. She paused, letting the words penetrate. His greatest weakness was not prejudice, Mr. Blackstone. He believed that being Philippine meant being submissive, that being a woman meant being weak, that being an employee meant being disposable. While the lawyers left the room, Richard remained alone, processing the magnitude of his fall. In less than 24 hours, he had lost his position, his reputation, and possibly his fortune, all for underestimating a woman he considered insignificant. Outside, Maria took a deep breath for the first time in 18 months. The plan had worked perfectly, but it was not about personal revenge. It was about proving that underestimating the right people can be the most expensive mistake anyone can make. On his phone, a message from Dr. Patricia Chen. 3 rival companies have already called offering executive positions to you. It seems that Seattle finally discovered the value of a true leader. The storm that Richard had caused was just beginning, and Maria Santos had become the eye of the hurricane that would rewrite the rules of power in one of the most influential companies on the West Coast. But the question that remained was, how does anyone rebuild a life after losing everything for their own prejudices? 6 months later, Maria Santos was sitting on the main table of Forbes' conference on leadership and innovation, in front of an audience of 2,000 executives and entrepreneurs from all over the country. The auditorium was silent as she completed her presentation on inclusive leadership, how diversity drives extraordinary results. Turning discrimination into opportunity is not about revenge, she said, her voice clearly echoing through the microphone. It is about proving that excellence has no color, gender, or origin. It is about building something larger than those who tried to diminish us could ever imagine. The ovation of Foot lasted 5 minutes. Among the faces in the audience, Maria recognized several executives who had worked with Richard Blackstone and witnessed her spectacular fall. Now they applauded her as CEO of the consulting firm herself, which in just 6 months had become the most sought-after corporate diversity firm on the West Coast. In the front row, he sat, Dr. Patricia Chen, now her partner at the firm Chen and Santos Consulting. Beside her, Harold Blackstone Sr., who had become one of the company's leading investors after personally witnessing how his son's prejudice had almost destroyed a family empire built over decades. After the conference, Maria received a call from Jennifer Walsh, former HR director at Blackstone Industries. Maria, did you see the news about Richard? She had not seen, but Jennifer quickly explained. Richard had tried to get a job at several Seattle technology companies, but his reputation preceded him. The recording of his discriminatory statements had become viral on social networks, becoming a case study in business schools on how prejudice can destroy careers and entire companies. He's working as a freelance consultant now, Jennifer continued. He lost his house, his wife divorced from him, and I heard that she is doing therapy to deal with the consequences of her own choices. Maria was not pleased to hear about Richard's suffering. He had overcome anger for a long time. I hope he learns and becomes a better person, he answered sincerely. What impressed her most were the changes in a larger scale that her case had caused. 3 bills on workplace discrimination were approved in the state of Washington. Dozens of technology companies have implemented more rigorous diversity policies, and most importantly, 200 Philippine employees in various corporations received retroactive wage promotions and increases after their companies conducted internal audits to avoid similar scandals. That night, while organizing papers on her new office overlooking Elliott Bay, Maria found a letter that had arrived that day. It was from a young Portland Philippine engineer who had attended the conference. Mrs. Santos, said the letter, her example gave me the courage to denounce discrimination in my company. For years I accepted smaller wages and unfair treatment because I thought I had no choice. Today protocol my complaint in the Labor Department. Thank you for showing us that we can be more than victims. We can be agents of change. It was the 10th similar letter I received that week. Maria looked at photography on her table. She herself a year ago, pregnant and vulnerable, sent of the humiliated in Richard's office. Beside, a recent photo of her on the Forbes conference stage, radiating confidence and power. Between the 2 images, a transformation that perfectly exemplified the lesson he had learned. Your phone rang. It was an invitation to be the main speaker at the National Convention of Executive Women. The theme, How to Transform Adversity into Extraordinary Leadership. Across the city, Richard Blackstone was in his small rented apartment, watching on television the interview Maria had given after the conference. When the reporter asked if she kept resentment against people who discriminated against her in the past, her answer surprised him. "Resentment is like drinking poison waiting for the other person to die," she had said. "I prefer to use my energy by building a future where other people don't have to go through what I've been through. The best revenge is the success that inspires others to achieve their own greatness." Richard hung up the television and looked into the mirror. For the first time in months, he was able to see beyond self, pity itself. Maria Santos had become more than the woman he had tried to destroy, had become the living example that some people are simply bigger than the circumstances they face. 3 days later, Richard made a decision that would change the course of his life. He called Dr. Patricia Chen and asked for a meeting, not to negotiate or justify your past actions, but to offer something you had never offered before, a complete confession about the discriminatory practices you had implemented, including names from other executives involved and companies that operated similarly. "I want to help you prevent others from doing what I did," he said during the meeting, his voice broken for the first time in years. "I can't undo the past, but I can guarantee that my experience is used to protect other people." Patricia and Maria exchanged looks. It was a turnaround that neither had expected, but could exponentially amplify the impact of his struggle for justice. 6 months after this meeting, Richard had become a key witness in 4 major processes of racial discrimination. His testimony helped expose a network of discriminatory practices that extended to dozens of companies in the Seattle region. Maria's story has proven that underestimating the right people can be the most expensive mistake anyone can make. But more importantly, it has shown that true victory is not in destroying who has harmed us, but in building something so significant that it makes everything they tried to do against us irrelevant. The little pregnant Philippine who was once humiliated into an executive office had become the leader who rewritten the rules of the game, and in doing so not only conquered his own justice, he created a way so that thousands of other people could turn their own adversities into extraordinary triumphs. The final lesson was crystal clear. The best revenge is not to reduce their enemies to their bitterness, but to rise so much that they become irrelevant. Mary had learned that true strength never comes from never falling, but how we choose to get up when everyone believes we will be on the floor forever. And Richard? He found that real redemption does not justify the past, but to accept responsibility and dedicate the future to repair the damage caused. Some people need to lose everything to find their humanity. If this story of transformation and justice has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more reports that prove that our greatest strength never comes from never falling, but how we choose to get up when everyone believes we will be on the floor forever.